So exciting new thing, Tantra for the modern world. The path of magic, pleasure and beauty. Whoa! I'm surprised there are not more people here, to be honest. So our new theme is what's sometimes called Tantra. And to introduce what that's about, I'd just like to talk a little bit about a problem that faces, I think, any spiritual path, any spiritual tradition. The problem that Buddhism faces, or the problem that any spiritual tradition faces, is that over time it tends to become respectable. So I think we can see a really extreme case of this happening with Christianity, for example. So the real hardcore early Christians, they did things like giving up all sense of personal possessions and living in communities where everything was completely shared. And their leaders travelled throughout the Roman world saying really unwelcome things that subverted the normal culture, and as a result were killed in all sorts of really interesting ways. And then over time, this ultra-radical spiritual political movement of do-or-die zealots, perhaps nutcases, I don't know. This do-or-die movement of zealots transmogrifies into the Church of England. Go to church once a week, vote Conservative, and you'll go to a heaven which is probably like a village in the Cotswolds. Christianity became respectable, normal, boring. And Buddhism has shown this very same tendency to become respectable over time. Less extreme, I have to admit, less extreme, but it's also shown this tendency. You might ask, well, is that a problem? Or why is that a problem? A lot of people don't think that's a problem, aren't going to think that's a problem. So Sangha tells us that when he first came back to the UK from being a monk in the East in the 1960s, people in the Buddhist society kept telling him, well, the first thing we've got to do, the really important thing we've got to do is make Buddhism respectable. We've got to make Buddhism respectable. People thought that was the right and necessary thing to do if we were going to introduce this Buddhism to this country. It had to be respectable. Sangha did not agree. In fact, Sangha's response was that was the last thing we should do. The last thing we should do was make Buddhism respectable. That we had to get back to the scary, exhilarating, challenging radicalism of the true Dharma, the holy Dharma. Which in many ways completely cuts across the worldly values that our society is based on. So instead of trying to make Buddhism respectable, Sangha said things like, well, if you're just working for money like most people are, say, to hell with financial security. And all the other mind-forged manacles that keep you stuck in a boring, pointless way of life. Stop being brainwashed by the advertising industry and politicians and big money, and do as little paid work as possible, and join us, get off the treadmill and join us in creating a completely new sort of society. Take all those risks. You won't get a pension, but you'll get a life. And of course, people went to the Buddhist society and and they chucked him out. He used to have a picture of a scapegoat on his wall, which was representative of being scapegoated. So, we don't really want a respectable Buddhism, because a respectable Buddhism becomes a safe, lukewarm Buddhism. And a little lukewarm, safe spiritual practice is not going to transform our deep volitions. The deep volitions that shape our lives, changing ingrained old habits of being. to do that, it needs intensity. It needs an intense practice, even a risky practice. Intensity and safety don't necessarily go together. So, at least twice in Buddhism's long history, probably many more times, but twice in a quite big way, Buddhism in some quarters seems to have become a bit too respectable, a bit too much like the Church of England, so that it needed to get back to the real exciting intensity of the Buddha's early Sangha. So Buddhism needs to keep reinventing itself. And maybe we need to reinvent it to a certain extent as well for some very different circumstances. So in this series of talks, between now and the end of the year, we're going to exploring one of the ways that Buddhism got back closer to that original radical spirit, that exciting spirit of the Buddha's original teaching, that maybe the mainstream had lost contact with. And this is what is sometimes called Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. So, the word Tantra just means thread, which doesn't particularly mean very much. It just means a discourse, a thread. Tantric Buddhism is perhaps more properly called Vajrayana Buddhism. And maybe that conveys a bit more, because a Vajra, yana means way or vehicle. And a Vajra is a symbol. It sort of derives from a sort of celestial thunderbolt, which was the ultimate weapon of the gods, the weapon that destroyed all things and couldn't be destroyed. And it's got two real meanings. One meaning is diamond, and the other meaning is thunderbolt. So it's sometimes translated as diamond, and sometimes it's translated as thunderbolt, but really it's a diamond thunderbolt. And it's got the qualities of both. So it's got the qualities of a thunderbolt. It smashes, it breaks through, and it illuminates shockingly and brightly. A thunderbolt, the world would be dark, and then suddenly, wow, it's clear just for a flash. So it's got the qualities of a thunderbolt. Massive energy. And it's got the qualities of a diamond. So a diamond is harder than anything, will cut anything and cannot be cut. But it's also brilliantly crystalline, beautiful. I don't know if you ever looked into a diamond. Most of us don't get an opportunity very often to look into a big diamond, say. But it's like everything is crystal clear and brilliantly coloured in a diamond. So it's got all those qualities of energy, clarity, cutting through, indestructibility, this symbol of the Vajra, the diamond thunderbolt. So Vajrayana, the way of the diamond, the way of the thunderbolt, is a way that cuts through, that uses brilliance. It's very, very different from some approaches to Buddhism. It's much more about breaking through obstacles, shining brilliant light on the nature of reality, living in the full presence of reality, if you like, as much as we can. So this style of practice seems to have grown out of a sort of shamanic, magical tradition, which was, I suppose, originally outside of Buddhism. We could say that magic is a way of invoking, raising up, and then focusing and concentrating powerful energies, powerful emotional energies, energies of the will, to achieve worldly ends. So you do spells that sort of get all your energies going. You go dig up skulls or something. You sort of get fingers from dead people. I don't know. You do all sorts of things. You go out at midnight into graveyards. I don't know. So you do things that really make you alive and full of energy. And you somehow focus that. You somehow focus that on getting what you want. You focus all that will and all that energy on getting what you want, destroying your enemy or making somebody fall in love with you. And what Tantra seems to have risen as is a sort of sort of framing of those magical techniques from getting what you want in a worldly sense to getting what you want in a spiritual sense. So doing powerful rituals that raise up all sorts of your energy and focus it on destroying the obstacles to your spiritual progress, or to, instead of making somebody fall in love with you, to making you fall in love with enlightenment. So it grew out of that tradition. It grew out of a sort of magical tradition, and that fairly weird background was both a strength and a weakness. It was both a strength and a weakness. It was a strength because, well, it certainly freed Buddhism from respectability. But it was a weakness because sometimes the true Dharma got very mixed up with silly superstition and folk belief. Sometimes it lost contact with the real aims of the Dharma and degenerated into folk magic, or even sometimes black magic. So it's a right mixed bag. I don't think we can just sort of copy it. I think I need to say a bit more about that later. We need to translate it. So that will be part of my theme, is that it'd be really good to know more about Tantra, but we need to know what it's about, and then sort of translate it into ways that are sort of shorn of some of the disadvantages. So, yeah, I've spoken about the Dharma and any other tradition becoming respectable. And when a tradition becomes respectable, one of the ways this shows up is that it can all become a bit abstract. It becomes a matter of talking about abstract ideas, maybe, rather than actual transformation in daily life. Or it becomes about paying lip service to high ideals and grandiose goals, instead of sort of getting down into the muck and the mire of what's actually going on in our minds and our hearts and dealing with that. Or it becomes about worshipping sacred divine beings from a vast distance without trying to bring more sacredness into our life, into our actual environment and our life. And this seems to be a bit what happened to Mahayana Buddhism, a lot of Mahayana Buddhism, which was the second great wave of Buddhism that became dominant through all of the Buddhist world except Southeast Asia. So sutras within the Mahayana tradition, they're often these marvellous, cosmic, visionary masterpieces expressing the most exalted spiritual vision of the nature of things, but they often don't tell you what to do, how to actually practice when you get up in the morning, or when somebody's horrible to you at work, or etc., etc. They forget that, if in a way, what really matters is dealing with that sort of mud and muck of our daily life. And the style of Buddhism we call Tantric seems to have evolved as a way of getting back to real experience, real concrete experience, getting out of this world of abstractions and getting down to what's real. And it seems to have risen, as I said, outside the respectable world of the monasteries, among small groups of practitioners with a sort of shared approach centred around a guru. So, a quote, Vajrayana was a challenge and reaction to established forms of Buddhism which had become infected with the conventional attitudes of secular society. So Buddhism had been around for 1,500 years, certainly more than 1,000 years. And it had sort of lost its spiritual impetus. And Tantra challenged that. And one of the ways it challenged it was it broke out of the traditional monk-lay division and promoted the really unrespectable ideal of the siddha, the sort of adept, and the siddha and his cohorts, his brotherhood and his sisterhood, they might just as well practice in a cremation ground as in a monastery, or in the middle of the jungle, or in a forest, or in a shanty town. And they're much more likely to wear rags than nice robes. Or perhaps they'd be wearing the robes of a king, but not the robes of a monk in all likelihood. And as I say, there's lots of lovely, inspiring stuff in this tradition, and I personally get very inspired by aspects of it. I mean, it's really sort of livened up my feeling for the Dharma just thinking about this series. But I don't think we can just copy the traditional forms of Tantra that have come down to us. We can't pretend we're medieval Tibetans or Japanese. What we need to do is look at the Tantra and sort of reinvent it. So I think there's many, many ways in which we in Triratna are engaged in forging a sort of Western Tantra, a Western Vajrayana, and maybe that will become more apparent as we go along. We're trying to forge a style of Buddhism that cuts through all the incrustations of several thousand years of accumulated tradition to get back to that sort of diamond, brilliant radicalism of the Buddha's teaching, to find what's really transformative for real people, getting out of the abstractions. And that's what we're going to be exploring over the next few months. How can we translate that tradition to get the same transformative cutting edge in our practice? So to do that, I think we have to stand back and ask, what were the principles behind Vajrayana Buddhism? What were the principles behind it? If we look at the details, my heavens, there's loads of details. There's loads of fascinating practices and different figures and all sorts of things. We get lost. We just completely get lost in all this fascinating detail. So we need to stand back and say, okay, what are the principles and what can we learn from the principles? How can we apply those same principles in a way that's going to work for us? So in his book on tantric figures, Vasantra, an order member called Vasantra, tells us that the Tantric Buddhism had 7 main characteristics. And obviously they're all joined. Everything's all joined, isn't it? Obviously they're all joined, these 7 characteristics, and some of them sort of overlap quite a lot. So I've sort of cut them down to 5. I've cut them down to the 5 that I think are most important. So his first one is the point I've made already. Tantra is concerned with direct experience. It's not about abstractions, it's not about ideals that we can't actually practice, it's about direct experience. And that's the main aspect I'm going to talk about tonight, so I'll say more about that later. So that's the first one. Tantra is about direct experience. The second one is Tantra works with symbols and magic. As I've said, it sort of derived from a magical tradition, and a lot of it is based on rituals around evoking and connecting with powerful symbols, powerful archetypal figures, or acting in a way that brings sort of the mythic into our daily life. And we'll have several talks. We're going to have several talks on that aspect of Vajrayana. We're going to have how we can use ritual, symbol, and archetype, and myth and archetypal figures in our practice. How we already do, how people do use those in their practice in our tradition. So that's the second one. Tantra works with symbols and magic. The third is Tantra is concerned with energy. Sometimes there seems to be a conflict between being good and having energy. Sometimes we think that to be good we have to sort of dampen ourselves down. A lot of our energy comes from lower, coarser drives that seem to belong more to the animal realm than to the spiritual realm. Drives like desire, aggression, competitiveness, fear even. A lot of it comes from down there. But it takes a lot, that's where a lot of our energy is, and it takes a lot of energy to change, to really change in a deep way, to change the currents that drive us through life. We need to become beings who are full of energy. We need to become beings who are brimming with energy. Enlightenment doesn't mean being sort of a bit dull, very good. It means being really vibrant, living really vividly. So we need to have energy. We need to bring energy into our practice, both in order to change and to be the people we could be. So we can't afford to cut off our sources of energy. We can't afford to cut them off because they seem a bit sort of unspiritual. What we've got to do is transform them. We've got to transform them. We've got to transform our lower energies and make them work for us. And that is a huge aspect of Vajrayana. So in a few weeks, Padma Vajra is going to come and he's going to talk to us a bit about this aspect. He's going to talk about how we, the tantric approach to releasing our energies and using them rather than holding them down. So then the fourth one is Tantra makes use of the strongest experiences of life. So if you think about your life, if you think about when you've fallen in love, when you've really wanted something, when you've really been furious with somebody or some injustice, when you've been terrified, there's a lot of energy in those states. There's loads of energy in those states. By contrast to the energy that we have when we're in those states, the energy we normally bring to the spiritual life, okay, maybe I'll meditate for 20 minutes. The energy, by contrast to the sort of pouring out of energy we get in those states, the energy we put into our practice is pretty, probably, if you're like me, not in that intensity at all. When we really want something, we put loads of energy into it. When we're angry or afraid, we're just full of energy. We're just beings of energy. If we could redirect that sort of energy and get it stirred up, if we could get the sort of energy that's stirred up by the big experiences of life and direct that towards change, to propel us towards enlightenment, we'd be there. We'd be there in no time. So Vajrayana Buddhism sets out to use those energies. It sets out to use those energies. And I think one way that our approach in Triratna could be called Vajrayana is that we also set out to use the energy of pleasure in particular. We've been talking about this over the last few weeks. We set out to not suppress our desire for pleasure, but to coax our pleasure to higher levels, to use pleasure as a way that really moves us towards enlightenment. So Padmasambhava, whose festival we're going to be celebrating on Sunday, the great sort of archetype, if you like, of the Tantric Guru, in one of the scriptures, poems that he wrote, it says, "I do not abandon pleasure, I take it with me on the path." Meaning we need to redirect our search for pleasure. We need to redirect our search for pleasure so that we get our pleasure from the things that really make us happy and fulfilled. We coax our pleasure towards those and use them to raise our level of being. So that's pleasure. And then also there's as I said, there's a terrific amount of energy tied up in things like anger and fear. That's why you get some truly weird and even really shocking images in Vajrayana Buddhism. So you get what are called wrathful deities, wrathful figures that seem to be expressing raw anger. So, I mean, an example of that would be Vajrapani, for example, he who holds the Vajra. So he's depicted as this huge, well, he's not really a man, this huge chap. He's got sort of legs like bodies, and body like a tree trunk. He's huge and he's ugly. And he's draped in animal skins and skulls and things. And he's holding a Vajra and he's striding forward, surrounded by a halo of flame. Thrusting forward with this symbol of indestructible energy, the Vajra, breaking through obstacles. You don't want to meet him. So, anger, but anger in the service of aggression, and that pure energy of that warrior spirit redirected redirected towards breaking through the obstacles that keep us away from what we could be, what keeps us trapped, all the stuff that keeps us a bit bored in life. All that directed to breaking through all of that. So it's a very, very unusual Buddhist image. Actually, he arose a bit before Tantra, but there's loads like him in Tantra, really. These really scary figures that are doing things like riding weird beasts and holding their enemies' hearts in their hands and just thoroughly weird. But all in a way getting at this sort of redirection of energy. So it's said that what Padmasambhava is famed for is taming the demons of Tibet. He went to Tibet and all these energies opposed the Dharma and he converted them. And that's very, very symbolic of converting these weird energies to the service of the Dharma. And those demons in Tibet were said to become Dharma protectors. And it's these Dharma protectors who are sort of shown in this, these sort of archetypes of breaking through, of using some energies that maybe we normally don't want to mess with for actually getting somewhere on the spiritual life, breaking through obstacles. So we get that sort of imagery. It's about using the energy of anger, if you like, aggression. We get imagery that's to do with fear, that evokes fear, the energy of fear. So you get lots of bones and skulls full of stuff that looks suspiciously like blood, and sometimes even bits of eyeballs. And it's like a horror movie. I mean, what's that all about? Well, you try holding that sort of thing in your mind, an image of that sort of thing in your mind, and not having some energy come up. It doesn't happen, actually. It's very, very difficult to be unmoved and not have energy brought up by that sort of thing. I mean, if you think of Padmasambhava, a lot of people find just thinking of Padmasambhava raises a whole load of energy. But that's partly because I think he's got a skull cup and some severed heads on his trident and all sorts of other imagery like that. Well, it raises energy, it raises energy. I mean, it's the same sort of energy that's raised by a horror movie. I mean, kids love horror movies, don't they? All that energy is sort of slightly exhilarating. So you get a lot of that sort of thing. So even fear can be an energy that we can redirect. And that's sort of part of the way Tantra operates. You see that very much in its imagery. And we're going to have talks on using that sort of energy, the energy of falling in love. How we can use the energy of falling in love to propel us towards the Dharma. How we can use the energy of anger to propel us towards the Dharma. And how we can use the energy that we get when we face really scary situations in our life. How we can use that as an actual help rather than a hindrance to move towards the Dharma. We're going to have three talks on that. Three short talks, 3 whole talks on that. And then the final characteristic, the fifth characteristic that I'm going to steal from the Tantra is that Tantra begins at the highest point. So what the dickens does that mean? What he means by this is that Vajrayana practices often ask us to pretend that we're enlightened now, to imagine that we're enlightened now, and behave like that. Imagine that the world is as an enlightened being would see it, and behave as though we were in that world. It's asking us to act as if. So generally, the Dharma encourages us to see that we're not enlightened, to work with the law of karma, to do the things that gradually make us more enlightened. And this is sort of starting at the opposite end and saying, hey, just be enlightened now. Or at least act as enlightened as you can. Bring as much enlightenment into the way you act now as you can. Now, there's real dangers in this. I mean, one of the big dangers in this is what's called inflation. Inflation basically is a posh Buddhist word or spiritual word for getting a big head. Okay, so well, I'm enlightened, you're pretending to be enlightened, you're acting as if, so you think you are, which you aren't. But really, but in all forms of Buddhism, acting as if is an important part of practice, actually. So when we practice the precepts, even though we don't want to, we're choosing to act as if we were enlightened now, and that has the effect of making us more enlightened. It has the effect of strengthening those parts of us that are enlightened. So it's sort of like bringing the future into the present, bringing the future that could be into the present. And acting as if in this way really does move us forward. And I'm going to say a bit more about the first of these 5 characteristics of Vajrayana, and link it with the last one. So the 5 characteristics were, if I can remember rightly, it's about direct experience. It uses ritual, magic, myth, symbolism, archetypes. Excuse me.
Energy.
What was the last one? Energy. It's about energy. You'll have to excuse me, I'm feeling a bit dopey this evening. It's about energy. It uses the strongest experiences of life, and it starts at the end. It starts at the highest point. It asks us to start at the highest point. So, what about the first one? What about the first of those characteristics? What about it's concerned with direct experience? What does it mean to root our practice in direct experience? And how did the traditional Vajrayana do that? And how can we learn from what it did and do it ourselves? So I'm just going to take one example about that. One way that Vajrayana did that was to embody abstract ideas in everyday reality. Very often, so bring it down to everyday reality. So one example of that would be what we call the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. So it's a characteristic of a Buddhist is someone who, the jargon says, goes for refuge to the 3 jewels. A Buddhist is somebody who, in a way, bases their life around the 3 jewels. The Buddha, what we could become, the ideal of human enlightenment. The Dharma, the teaching about the way to that. The Sangha, the spiritual company of the spiritual community. But how do the 3 jewels manifest in our actual experience? So what about the Buddha? How does the Buddha manifest in our actual experience? The Buddha has been dead for 2,500 years or so. How can the Buddha be a fact in our actual experience, our everyday experience? And then the Dharma, well, there's an enormous amount of the Dharma. If you go into our library, you'll see there's a whole shelf, which is just the Pali Canon. That's just the discourses of the Buddha that are recorded in Pali. One tradition, that represents one tradition, if you like. And then you've got, over time, an accumulated mass of other Dharma aimed at people at different levels of practice, people with different temperaments, people from different cultures. How are you going to somehow go for refuge, if you like? How are you sometimes going to base your life on anything as huge and ungraspable as the Dharma? And then the Sangha. So traditionally it's said that what we go for refuge is what's called the Arya Sangha, the noble Sangha. In the Mahayana, that's seen as the glorious company of bodhisattvas. Certainly the people with really significant insight. Would we know who's got really significant insight? And have we ever met a glorious bodhisattva? And would we know him? Do we have any real life connection with such exalted beings? So I suppose the Vajrayana, in trying to get that down to, well, what's real about that, was asking, how do the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha manifest in our direct experience, our everyday experience? And you have to bear in mind that they were talking then to people who did practice in these small, tight-knit little brothers and sisterhoods, practicing the Dharma with a guru in this sort of very intense way. And the way they translated that was to say, well, okay, the tantric equivalent of the Buddha is your guru. You look upon your guru as though he were the Buddha, as though he or she were the Buddha. Your teacher, that is the closest you're going to get. And the tradition was that you basically do what your guru tells you. And basically, he's your teacher, you do what he tells you. So the Buddha becomes the guru. And the Dharma, slightly mysteriously, becomes the Yidam. The Yidam means the meditational deity. So Buddhists in this tradition, in many traditions, would meditate on an archetypal figure of some sort. And they're saying the Dharma is the figure that you meditate on, your Yidam. That's how it manifests in your daily life. That's always seemed very, very strange to me, I have to say. That's always seemed very, very strange. But I think I can make sense of it. So I think if we say we meditate daily on the Bodhisattva of compassion, as an example, that will have a more direct effect on our mind and the way we live and the way we act and the way we speak, meditating on that figure, connecting with compassion embodied, as it were. It's going to have a more of an effect on us than, say, reading a scripture that tells us to be compassionate. So maybe the figure that we meditate on is the Dharma for us, because it changes the way we actually act and live in the world. And then, most bizarrely, in the Tantric refuges, the Sangha is said to be the Darkini. So what the dickens is a Darkini? Okay. Now, a Darkinis really sum up a lot about Tantra. A Darkini is, well, it's sometimes translated as sky dancer, but in modern Indian languages it means a flesh-eating demoness. But Darkinis so they're slightly ambivalent figures. A bit dangerous, these figures. But they're usually often represented as young, naked, dancing women, dancing in the sky. Okay? They're sky dancers. Brilliantly coloured, beautiful, dancing, naked women. And I'm going to return to that image later. Maybe I'll say more, obviously, to get your attention. So one of them, Vajrayana, for example, she is shown as this beautiful, dancing, naked, red woman, red the colour of passion. She's said to have big breasts because she gives bliss and receives bliss. Causes bliss. She's holding a flesh chop, a bit like a butcher's instrument, which is actually the instrument that was used for carving up dead bodies in Tibet and feeding them to the vultures, in one hand, and a skull cup in the other, for which she's drinking something that looks awfully like blood, but is actually the amrita, the elixir. It's the nectar of bliss, of joy, and she's dancing on a trampled body which represents her old self. So she's about cutting off the old self and dancing nakedly into if you like, a new self. She's quite a tantric figure, actually. There's quite a lot like her. But what's that got to do with the Sangha? It'd be nice, wouldn't it? It'd be nice. Well, one of the things that the Darkinis represent is liberated, blissful energy, dancing. What could represent blissful energy more than dancing naked in the sky? Blissful energy, and Sangha talks about that in connection with the Sangha, as in particular the blissful energy that comes from being, as it were, naked, open, without protective coverings. completely yourself, completely open to others, with no masking, no masks, without pretenses. So at its best, Sangha, spiritual friendship, is a context in which we can start to let down our defences, take off our masks, be open and, as it were, naked. It's a context in which we can develop the friendships where we can really be ourselves, where we can reveal ourselves completely as we are. And because of that, we can get into real deep communication with other people, where we really are each other. We're not sort of mask meeting mask, we're real person meeting real person. And when we get into that sort of deep communication without masks and protective coloration, that releases a lot of energy, and it can be blissful, it can certainly be joyful. It gives us a feeling of joy and bliss. It energizes us, so maybe that's part of what the Dakini represents. So those are the three tantric refuges, the three ways that we used in that particular context. So what does the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha mean? They mean the Guru, the meditational deity, and the Dakini. Well, that's all very well, but it's probably not going to really work for us, is it? I mean, they're not really part of our experience. It's still a bit abstract and maybe not all that helpful. So what we need to do is translate that. We need to ask ourselves, okay, where is the Buddha in my everyday experience? What's the Dharma that I keep in mind, that was with me from the moment I wake up in the morning and affects my actions and the way I am in the world? What does the Sangha mean in my daily experience? And for a start, taking the Guru as the manifestation of the Buddha is probably not particularly helpful. We in Triratna, we don't think in terms of having a guru, we don't think in terms of gurus. Not someone you look up to as the Buddha incarnate and whose word is, as it were, law. You just do what they say. We don't think in those terms. That's proved to be a pretty dangerous idea in the West, because it's often fed into people giving up their individuality. And it's been dangerous for gurus because they've got inflated. Even people with quite a spiritual background can get inflated if everybody thinks, "Oh, you're just so wonderful. I just wish I could be like you. Everything you do is wonderful." Even when you do something which is blatantly unskillful, it's just you trying our faith out. That can be a rather seductive way of seeing things. So we don't do gurus, okay? No gurus. We do spiritual friends, we do even teachers, but not gurus. So how does the Buddha actually manifest in our experience? So we could ask ourselves, in our experience, are there people we recognise as more enlightened than we are, for example, for a start? Are there people who honestly we think, well, yeah, he or she has gone further than I have? We don't need to think of them as Buddhas, but we can aspire to develop the qualities we see in them. We could take their advice seriously. We could use them as helpful guides. So there's real people. We could extend that to fictional people or historical people. Are there? It's great to read about great people and the qualities that people can have. And we can bring those together into a composite picture of how magnificent can a human being be? How magnificent have people been in the past? We could even use fictional figures to connect with that. Because, in a way that's using our imagination, but our imagination what we imagine, we do experience. It is part of our direct experience. It's not abstract in a way. So how magnificent is it possible for a human being to be? We could imagine the most magnificent being we can sort of conjure up, if you like. We could even think, how magnificent could I be? How magnificent is it possible for me to be? We could think, what would it, we could imagine us as we could possibly be. And all of that could perhaps feed into a sense of the goal that we're moving towards. And slightly more difficult to grasp might be the idea that we could use our experience of beauty as a way of invoking, as it were, the Buddha. When we experience that sort of heart lift that we get, perhaps looking into the blue sky, or looking over the expanse of the sea, or over a landscape of hills, etc., or seeing a sunset, or listening to a piece of music, or seeing a beautiful piece of art, when we sort of experience that heart lift from beauty, we can sort of refer it to something beyond itself. The beauty of the spiritual ideal, the beauty of reality, which is coming through to us as a sort of glimmer through that. We can allow that to lead us beyond the particular thing to beauty itself, beauty of reality. So when we see a sunset, our heart lifts and we can think, well, that's what the Buddha's like. The Buddha's like that. To be a Buddha would be like that. That expansiveness of the ocean that we see. That's what the Buddha would be like. That full moon on the ocean. That's what it would be like to be a Buddha. That's what the Buddha is like. That's what reality is like. I've got a particular thing about cathedrals, actually. I love great church architecture. So I think if you go into a cathedral, especially if it's not full of tourists, you see this building that sort of grows out of the ground but seems to sort of surge upwards. It seems to have this huge upward energy. And it's full, it's this huge silent space shot through with coloured light from the windows. Resonant and sort of silent, all sort of centred on this image of integration at the end, which has no theological significance to me, but the cross at the end just signifying unity. Somehow all of that can come together. It's like, that's what it would be like. That's what it would be like. That's in glass and stone. That's what a really higher mental state would be like. So, yeah, I mean, that might not work for you. You might be thinking, what's he on about? But your own way of what gives you that sort of heart lift, what gives you that sort of connection with something that seems to be beyond the usual. And then the Dharma. So we need to focus on a bit of the Dharma, the bit of the Dharma that we need to practice right now. The bit of the Dharma that we need to practice right now that's going to be transformative. So it could be a precept we want to act on more and more. A quality like mindfulness, perhaps, or metta. A short piece of the Dharma that we can carry in our mind all the time. It will change the way we respond to the world. It will change the way we respond to other people. So there's a tradition called the mind training tradition. It has these wonderful slogans, they call it. Slogans is how they translate it, which are just short, pithy bits of Dharma that you just remember and you carry around with them. You could try one of these, for example. There's a saying that you get enlightened through practicing 4 lines of Dharma, not the whole shelves of it. So you could try, for example, be grateful to everyone. How about that? Go through life, everyone you meet, you treat them as though they're the person who saved your life. Be grateful for everyone. Is that going to change things? If you could carry that around with you and do it all the time. You could remember that. Be grateful to everyone. I'm really grateful to this person. It would completely change the way we live. That's one of them. Drive all blame onto one. That's another. And what that means is don't blame other people, blame yourself. So if you're experiencing dukkha, don't think, well, it's their fault. If you get angry, don't think, well, he made me angry. You think, actually, I make my negative mental states. It's my responsibility. Stop blaming other people. Totally transforms the way we approach life. Drive all blame onto one. I mean, you could come up with any number of them. look in the Bodhicharya Avatara for these things, as well as the mind training tradition. There's some great ones like, always be the first to smile. Oh, that's quite nice, isn't it? I mean, it's a little one, but always be the first to smile. That might change things, mightn't it? So I think what we need to look for is small bits of Dharma that we just really practice intensely. We narrow it down to a sharp focus and we really practice it intensely. That's what it means to sort of be like a Vajra, to cut through. And then the Sangha. Well, the Sangha is not we need to have the Sangha that's not some grand abstraction like the glorious company of bodhisattvas and arahants, or the community of all Buddhists through time and space. What the Sangha really means is us. This motley crew that we're actually in contact with in our daily life. These flawed people with all their annoying characteristics. Wish they wouldn't be that way. At least this is real. This is real. This is not an abstraction. If I'm going to get anywhere, I need to forgive these people their flaws and hope they forgive me mine. I need to work on my faults that cut me off from them. I need to develop friendships with them, although they're not perfect. I need to learn to be more open with them, be myself, dance like the darkening. I need to see myself as engaged in a common project with them and join in. Let go of my individualistic desire to keep myself aloof and join in. That is the Sangha jewel for us. That's real in our experience. So I think the way the Vajrayana sort of redoes the three refuges and the way we could sort of do that for ourselves is just one example. It's just one example of turning abstract ideas into concrete reality, making them down to earth. We'll come across a lot more as we go through this series because that sort of thing runs right through the Vajrayana. But I think I'd like to finish by just pointing out how this characteristic of Vajrayana, rooting it in direct experience, is connected with the last of the characteristics that I talked about, starting from the highest point, if you like. All too often, I mean, the sort of classic, let me develop myself in the direction of enlightenment, it's an approach to enlightenment that we absolutely need. We absolutely need it. But there can be a real danger that we sort of postpone being more enlightened till some future time, which just never comes. And what the sort of Vajrayana approach is asking us to do instead of that is to sort of summon up the strength each day, the vividness in our experience each day, to manifest as much of enlightenment as we can now. To be as enlightened as we can be now. Be the sword that cuts through habit, the Vajra that cuts through habit. Breaks through the old deadening patterns and the old routines. Faces reality moment by moment. We could call it mindfulness, but very often mindfulness seems a bit sort of not very energetic, like knowing where your shoes are. This is something different. This is like bringing really diamond quality attention to our life and living vividly. Be as enlightened as we can. Has edge and bring edge and brilliant precision into every moment. Be the Dharma. Manifest as much as we can of the brilliant awakened state right now, all the time. Just remember to do that. As much of it as we can imagine, as much of it as we can muster. With that sort of practice of brilliant, bright attention. Like a warrior in battle. So, that's an example of sort of tantric thinking. Use warrior energy. Warrior energy, horrible. No, warrior energy, great. Use it. use it to defend ourselves against the sort of seductive pull of deadening old patterns, to break through to the frightening brilliance of reality. Attack each moment with that sort of Vajra. Make each moment an opportunity. The Buddha says, I mean, this goes right back to the Buddha, said, you practice like your turban was on fire. Right? The fire is the suffering caused by old, degraded ways of being. And if your turban was on fire, hey, you would really do it. We need that strength to manifest as much upliftedness and clarity and truth and metta as we can muster every moment. So what we're doing is sort of bringing the future into the past. Instead of allowing ourselves to be ruled by the past, what has happened, we're allowing ourselves to be ruled by the future, what could happen, the being I could be, the enlightened being I could be. Make that what rules us, not the past. There's a myth about Merlin the magician that he lived backwards. It's a magical tradition. He lived backwards, and I think, so he started out as an old man, he got younger and younger. I think that might be a way of saying that when you think magically, you base your life on what could be, bringing into existence what could be, rather than the stuff from the past that limits us. So I'd just like to leave you, if you like, with this image of really being vibrant in every moment, and reconnecting that with this image of the Darkani. I think the Darkani is a real, just the image of what it would be like to live like that, to be naked, blushing with passion, dancing in the sky, cutting off our old self with a butcher's implement, drinking something that's scary but is actually really blissful, and trampling on our old self, while giving bliss to others and ourselves through our very large breasts. So that's an introduction to the Vajrayana.